Hello viewers, Sam Stafford here, reporting from home in Ripponden in West Yorkshire. As you may know, if you have listened to episode number 136 of my podcast, there was something of a gap between it and episode number 135. And to help catch up with everything in between, which was a lot, I invited some friends of the podcast, old and new, to discuss some of the policy areas of most interest to them, and hopefully to you viewers. 9 conversations were recorded, elements of which form part of episode number 136, but I am publishing them all in full here on the YouTube channel. This is the 5th of the 9, and is a conversation between Claire Petricca-Riding, Hana Loftus, Nina Pindham and Neil Beamsley about development and nature recovery. Claire is Head of Planning and Environment at Irwin Mitchell. Hannah is a Director at HAT Projects. Nina is a Barrister at Cornerstone Barristers. And Neil is Group Head of Biodiversity at Bellway. Their conversation takes in the proposed Nature Restoration Fund and environmental delivery plans, DEFRA's land use framework, and whether it is possible to create a win-win for both nature and for the economy. Enjoy!
We've had quite a lot of activity in recent weeks in terms of the working paper, the Development and Nature Recovery working paper, but obviously also then the Nature Restoration Fund. That's we've had more detail on that in the Planning and Infrastructure Bill that was released yesterday. So the issues are that obviously from the government's point of view, and taking their blurb from I keep saying it's a fun fact sheet, but it's not, it's just a fact sheet, but I read fun fact sheet, that the sustained economic growth is the number one mission of this government, but this cannot come at the expense of our natural environment. A healthy natural environment is essential both in its own right and for sustained and resilient growth. So do we think, as a starter for 10, do we think that the working paper, together with what we've seen that's come out yesterday, do we think that that is an acceptable way forward? And do we think that it breaks the status quo that the government had perceived to be before the working paper?
I'm going to be a bit broader, and of course, you can cut me off, Claire, if I go a bit too broad. But I do want to start with looking just at the evidence. And while the Nature Restoration Fund is actually quite narrow in scope, the working paper does set out quite comprehensive reforms. So we are going to get wider reforms down the road, environmental outcome reports, not least of which. Just setting the scene, really. The government data that I've been able to get a hold of for the last financial year, only up to 2023, but for the year preceding 31st of March 2023, that said that LPAs in England, and I should be careful of acronyms, local planning authorities in England received 395,624 planning applications. Of those, only 332 were EIA development applications. So it's not blocking development up and down the country. It's actually 0.1%, and that's only EIA development, let alone Habitats Directive development, which is really where the Nature Restoration Fund is focusing its efforts. That said, these are the game-changing sites. They're the big ones that will make a big difference in getting the 1.5 million homes. And I think in terms of what's unacceptable, we've been going on and on about the issues with environmental assessments. And by that term, I mean SEA as well as EIA and appropriate assessments or habitats regulation assessments. We know that there are issues. We've been speaking about those, certainly my experience as a member of the UK Environmental Law Association, now a vice chair, for at least 15 years. The problems with the regime are not to do with the law, in my view. We kind of know how it works. We've been dealing with it for quite a long time. It's the implementation of it, and you'll have heard that before, but it's access to information, access to post implementation monitoring data, and access to capacity and expertise. So these are the biggies. And no matter what changes the government implements in terms of the Nature Restoration Fund, environmental outcome reports, environmental delivery plans, whatever, these three fundamental issues are going to dog everything. So I'll shut up now, Claire, but that's kind of, yes, it's unacceptable, but we know where the problems are, and they still need to be tackled.
Yeah, just to sort of follow on with what Nina was saying there, the underlying issue is that actually any kind of development is challenging for a whole range of reasons. And to single out ecology, biodiversity as the reason primarily why development isn't going ahead, I think is a little bit misguided. I think it is a very technically challenging thing to do. So from my perspective, in terms of residential development, it's very technically challenging. There are a lot of different plates spinning at the same time. There's a lot of overlapping deadlines. Therefore, it's a complex picture. And I think we certainly applaud the government's attempts to streamline and to make things more efficient moving forwards. But I would question, whether it is actually biodiversity and ecology that is the main blocker, which I personally don't think it is. And I have no evidence from colleagues across Bellway that is the case. But equally, we need more detail really in terms of what's been proposed over the last couple of days, particularly around costs to developers and availability of these solutions and how that's going to look in reality. So very, very cautiously welcome the intent, but I remain to be convinced on the application of it.
And Hannah, then, how can we really bring these elements to life? How can we try to change the public perception of these issues being blockers to development, actually, instead of them actually being quite critical to development and placemaking, and bringing these really into the heart of, making us have healthier communities and places where we work, rest and play.
I mean, I think it's really interesting, this kind of question around perception, if you like, and what you said, Neil, that in a way, trying to find maybe a convenient scapegoat sometimes for what is otherwise being held up in the system for a whole range of really complex reasons. But, the thing about the blockages that we're all experiencing, everybody working in the sector has been experiencing over the last few years, is that because we rightly have all of these responsibilities that we're trying to all deliver on, and individually they might sound quite simple, but it is the interaction between all of them that is so complex. You can't look at any of these things in isolation. So the interaction between, for instance, biodiversity on brownfield land and biodiversity in green sites. I think it's fascinating that human-made environments that didn't exist 50, 60, 100 years ago are now so biodiverse, and we haven't really caught up with how to even deal with that in nature recovery terms. And that's where I think the land use framework consultation is really interesting, but also isn't yet going far enough. So as most of you will be aware, the government published a relatively short, actually, thankfully only I think 36 pages of land use framework consultation document, which is a relief to some of us who have to trawl through many hundreds a lot of the time. And they talk about setting a vision for land use for the country, which sounds really positive, and they present a bunch of really interesting statistics around land use for nature, land use for agriculture, land use for development. But it's really notable that in that document there was only one map, and that map was of existing land use. There was nothing that even at the most basic level talked spatially about proposed land use. So they talk about percentage changes towards nature. And that's where the problem lies, isn't it? Because we actually have to identify real sites for this stuff, and that's what plan making and planning should be all about. But at the moment, it does feel a little bit like government and civil servants are really hoping that if they do lots and lots of big data analysis, the answer will be spat out and suddenly land will appear that will be the right land for the job. That's not, as we all know, how it works. We've got to be actually proactively identifying that land and arguing for it, and talking to communities about what that means. They talk about co-creation in that land use framework consultation, which I think is really positive as well. But that's a really difficult and in-depth conversation to have at the local level with local politicians, members, as well as just ordinary people and the farming community. I live in a farming area. A lot of my neighbours are farmers. I see, a huge amount of the debate here. I have the president of the NFU as a close neighbour of ours, so I hear this from all angles. They need to really consult and think about how people's lives are shaped by this, not just at a kind of statistical level.
Thanks, Hannah. So, taking all of those things into consideration, then, what are the pros and cons of dealing with the Nature Restoration Fund? Nina, do you want to
Yeah, and
pick up on
actually it
that?
ties in nicely with something I wanted to
Yeah.
tag on to Hannah's comments about, which is bringing people alongside this, because I don't know what everyone else on the call's experience is like, but it is local objection that's really the problem I come up against when I show up for a planning inquiry. So I think one of the main issues with the existing regime is this complexity. If you're a local resident, you get an environmental impact assessment. You don't know what, they're incredibly complicated. They're far too long, and they're incredibly technical. As a local resident, they don't understand what the hell is going on. So if they were more engaged and they could understand what the environmental assessments are actually telling them, if they were shorter, more streamlined, more straightforward, then that would actually help the whole regime and get some buy-in potentially. Although I suspect there will be some local opposition, whatever you do. So with the Nature Restoration Fund, one of my worries is tagged on to that, because it's just another layer of plans where we haven't really simplified the existing layers of plans we've got. So I want it to work very badly, because we definitely need streamlining of the system. But at the moment, I just see additional complexity being added in and nothing being removed, really, other than potentially at the end of the day, a strategic solution popped out for the environmental delivery plan when those are produced.
And is that how you're nodding, Neil? Is that how you feel about it? Is it going to add an extra layer of complexity that's not necessarily needed or wanted at the moment?
Yeah, I'm afraid so. Obviously, my caveat to this is that we've only really been digesting the detail for the last 12 or so hours, so it's still quite fresh. I think there's also quite a lot of misinformation that's popped up already on social media that I've been noticing that, from my interpretation of what they've written, isn't correct. I think from a developer's point of view, what we need more than anything else is certainty. And to think about things like BNG, for example, one of the great things about that is the certainty it gives us, because it's a process that everyone can follow. And actually, this has the potential to be something similar, particularly with things like nutrient neutrality, and actually water neutrality as well, really lends itself to this kind of strategic-based approach where, in the case of nutrient neutrality, it's catchment. So, you've got the ability to have an impact, a positive impact, anywhere in that catchment, in theory, because we know what the end effect is. It's the impact on the European side, which is generally at the coast. So anywhere within that kind of geographic area, you can affect these changes, and it will be positive in theory. It falls down, in my view, where you try and apply that to species, that you can't just lose species. Sorry, I'm taking my Bellway hat off a little bit now. I'm putting my ecologist hat on for a second. You can't just expect species to find new habitats if you displace them from a location. And I'm not convinced that the approach that we've seen over the last 24 hours has the granularity really to pick up on that impact. And that concerns me, that we're not actually having a positive effect, but also it's not standardized either. So from what I've read, it's not a case of it's mandatory for every development. It's mandatory in certain locations where you have an EDP in place and where Natural England think they can actually accommodate the impact from what that EDP in that location is offering. That's quite different to what's being spoken about on social media. So I think it's quite important to draw that distinction.
I think you make such a good point, because it's obviously, I think some of the commentary that I've seen, it feels like that the levy will be applied to all applications, but that's definitely not what I've read either. If it is, if you've got an environmental delivery plan in place, and obviously that's very specific to certain locations and in certain circumstances that Natural England have put those plans in place, that the levy would then be levied, sorry, the levy and the levied against that development. So yeah, it's not going to be a one size fits all at all, which obviously then creates the level of uncertainty, as you said. If for biodiversity, again, everyone's got to do it. So everyone's in it together, but not everyone's going to be in it together in that sense. And you make a good point in terms of some of the other issues. You can see that it would work for nitrate and water neutrality, where you've actually, if you collect all the financial payments that are made into that fund and have a much broader level of compensation and mitigation methods that are much more regional and strategic, you can see that that's going to then provide a much broader benefit to that particular area. But when you are then sort of coming down to sort of a very much more detailed pattern of species and habitat protection, that it might not necessarily work. Is that how you might see it as well, Nina?
Yes, and just following on from that, even where there is an environmental delivery plan in place, it's still voluntary unless Natural England specifies that it is a mandatory EDP. So even within the network itself, developers are able to opt out if it's a standard EDP as envisaged. So there are nuances within nuances there, but Neil's absolutely right. It's not mandatory across the board. So, and I completely echo what he said about species. The devil will be in the detail here, as it always is, and there's a lot of regulations down that will bring this into effect. But that's going to be the key issue, is really how this impacts on the ground, actual physical development impacts.
And also, the underfunding, really, the under-resourced nature of Natural England, how they're then going to start to put these environmental delivery plans in place, when they're already pretty crippled. I think, we've obviously got the statutory consultee review and the written ministerial statement that was announced this week. I know it didn't necessarily touch Natural England, but there has been some commentary about those other statutory consultees, such as Environment Agency and Natural England, who take, or perceived to take a long time. But we know that they're taking a long time to revert because they are under-resourced. So to add this extra layer of plans and resource and requirements and management, because obviously we still don't know how it's going to be managed, how it's going to be controlled. What if it fails? What happens if it is a mandatory EDP, but actually the developer says, well, we've got no viability to be able to pay that. What gives there? So, Hannah, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think your point around the resources is exactly right. And it's not just the quantity of resources, it's the type of people and the type of experience, because what this is talking about is a delivery role, and delivery role involves a whole lot of other skill sets in terms of actually how do you put together that plan and make it happen on the ground. And I think the great fear will be that, certainly from certain parts of the community, that it's all very well to have the plan, but what if the plan isn't actually delivered? What is it? And then we're losing out both ways, because you've got this money that's essentially sitting there, a bit like Section 106s can sit there for years and years and years, and actually nothing happens with them. And that's really demoralizing for communities as well, and really kind of leads to that lack of trust on the ground. So having the confidence that Natural England can really make this work is going to be so key, and they are going to have to work through other organizations that can actually monitor actual physical sites on the ground. So wildlife trusts, landowners, other partnerships, and all of that has got to be put together very quickly in order for this to start really having some effect. It's a very big ask, I think.
Yeah, definitely. So let's try and see what positives there are. How can it, Nina, how is there a positive way forward in terms of local nature recovery strategies and tying in with those? And is there a positive way forward there?
Yeah, when they're preparing the environmental delivery plan, Natural England is obliged to take into account the local nature recovery strategy if there's a protected site strategy or if there's a species conservation strategy. So if any of those three are in force in the area, then and presumably also if there's a draft of any of them, then those need to be taken into account. And then thereafter, it's really up to Natural England how that will feature in the environmental delivery plan. So potentially, yeah, in terms of a strategic scale solution to some of these issues, those will work really well together because when you're thinking at catchment scale in particularly, then those absolutely need to be dealt with and thought about and tackled, the issues tackled at that strategic scale.
Neil, wearing either of one of your hats, both hats, maybe at the same time, how do you feel?
I said before, I think if you've got examples like the work going on in Cambridge at the moment around water neutrality, and you've got the ability to create physical infrastructure, so a reservoir, pipes connecting, and that kind of thing, and that is tangible. I just worry that there's too much nuance, as Nina mentioned before, that we can get tangled up in, and ultimately it's not going to help. I'm also conscious, reading through the legislation, there's a significant proportion which talks about the right to appeal and judicial review. That to me just smacks of potential delay. And I think actually rightly that opportunity should be in there. But if we're trying to accelerate the process of development, and particularly residential development, I don't know. I just worry that actually we're not going to be any further forward. It's a lot of upsets and misunderstanding, but actually we're no further forward, and we still haven't solved the fundamental underlying issues of the process and why there are delays.
And do we think that as an overarching strategy, do we think that it would lead to more recovery, or is it just going to be sort of keeping the status quo? It's just going to be compensation and mitigation in terms of that, or do we think that it's going to lead to a sort of greater depth of nature recovery as opposed to just sort of merely restoration?
I think landscape scale is absolutely the way it should be. We have to be ambitious. We have to try and break the status quo in that respect. You don't do that by improving 1/4 of a hectare here and 1/4 of a hectare there. That's just not how it works. But my concern is that, as we've seen from BNG, it's a 30-year process. And the reason it's a 30-year process is because that's how long habitats take to mature. If you're expecting a new habitat to accommodate species that are displaced elsewhere, that's just not realistic, because nature doesn't work on that timescale. It can't adapt, and it can't evolve, and it can't mature to the way that biodiversity needs to evoke genuine improvement within that timescale. So I think that they've got to take a bit of a deep breath and a step back and look at these things. And if they are genuinely ambitious about pushing these things forwards, and they're using development as a tool to do that, there's got to be a realism about what development can be expected, because you can't expect developers alone to fix biodiversity. That's just not realistic. And it feels a lot of the time like we are being asked to do that. We're more than happy to do our share. We're more than happy to embrace new ways of doing things, but we're not the agent to fix this. We are part of a solution, but not the only solution.
I think the sector will agree with what you've just said there, especially when it came to the nitrate neutrality issue, and the sector felt that it was being unfairly penalised for overnight accommodation, and the effect that they might have on these obviously very sensitive areas, where if you were putting in a new farming practice or a manufacturing plant, which is also increasing the load, and then you would have escaped that. So definitely hear you there. And dare we mention environmental outcome reporting, because that's still obviously there. It's still part of the statute book, and I don't think it's going away anytime soon. So how would this interact with environmental outcome reporting?
Well, I'll pop in and then others can take up the mantle if you want. So obviously there's a potential where we were kind of hoping to get a bit more on EORs, I think, in this, because there's real potential there with environmental outcome reports. I'm more excited about those and the potential changes to the regime, the whole system that they're in LURA. The power is there already, government. So you can do it. You don't need a whole waft of new legislation. It's already there. But with EORs, I think there's scope for the outcomes identified in those to be funded by the Nature Restoration Fund. That's where I see the interaction, but we shall see. We've been told in due course we will get some more on environmental outcome reports. And you're right, Claire, it's not going anywhere.
Definitely. So to wrap all this up then, what are our final thoughts on this? Hannah, let's start with you.
Sure. I think, taking a few steps back and a bit of a longer term view, it's really great that government are talking about land use and nature recovery in the same sentence, and they're trying to join the dots. For a very long time, it felt like there were two such parallel conversations going on in two parts of Whitehall that never even tried to join up. So I think we really do need to welcome the fact that people are trying to get these things to work together. That's really, really positive. I'm of Hannah, so I think that planning's got to be part of the solution. We've got strategic spatial planning coming through now. That's absolutely got to be part of it, and I'd like to kind of see more there that is about actually identifying the land and the sites and talking about landscape and all of the things that you talked about, Neil, because that's the way this stuff is going to actually happen. This stuff has actually happened by drawing maps of stuff and what goes where and what land does need to be improved and what the catchments are for water and all the rest of it. So I think that there is a lot of positives here. It's going to take a huge amount of skills and energy and a lot of speed. And that's where I want planners and policymakers to be really bold. They've just got to get their pens out and draw those maps. They can't just hold back and hope that a sort of magical answer is going to appear.
And Neil, from both an ecologist's and a developer's perspective then, how do you feel going forward?
Yeah, I have concerns that the government have backed themselves into a little bit of a corner with all the talk around restriction around great crested newts and bats that was said in Parliament a couple of weeks ago. I think that's remiss of them in some respects, because I don't think that's reflective. So what I would say is I would really, really encourage government to listen to people who've got some really fantastic expertise in this field, to understand from a developer's point of view, from a planner's point of view, from an ecologist's point of view, because the ecologists are often forgotten in this, and they have some genuine expertise that can really inform this. So please listen. Please do try and take these things on board and actually be open about your comms. I think if we learn from BNG, there wasn't a great deal of out there public consultation, communication, blogs, whatever you want to call it, before we got the main thrust of the BNG legislation and stuff that underpins it. So I would hope they can be much more open and share what they're thinking more publicly, so we get a sense of what's going on, can plan accordingly.
The sector's been thinking about this for a long time. And just 2 years ago, we got an Office for Environmental Protection report on environmental assessments and the issues that need to be resolved. And that could be a blueprint for the government to make sure that these changes actually create tangible nature recovery at scale across the country. Because underpinning what they're trying to do, there is merit in that. Strategic scale mitigation is the way forward. But as we've all said, it's not just single developers that are able to resolve this problem. It's built up over decades, and it's a whole of society and whole of the economy problem that needs to be tackled accordingly.
Hello viewers, Sam again. My thanks to Claire, Hannah, Nina and Neil for letting me share that conversation with you. Look out for the other 8, which I will share on here in due course. They will feature conversations about devolution and strategic planning and local government reorganisation, CPO, land value capture and benchmark land value, infrastructure planning, modernising planning committees, grey belt, statutory consultees, design and placemaking, and the flood risk sequential test. Please do keep in mind, viewers, that 50 Shades of Planning is by planners and for planners. And so if you would like to use this channel for sharing anything you think that we need to be talking about, then do please feel free to get in touch with me via samstafford@hotmail.com. What have we learnt? Well, town and country planning is very much not a black and white endeavour. There are at least 50 shades in between. Bye for now.